Hey there, this lesson we're going to be looking at sensors. Now, before we get too deep into the drone sensors and what they can do, I want to talk about sensors in general and how they work and how we get from a sensor to a value in a program that's actually useful. Now, sensors are incredibly useful devices, and we have a wide variety of them that detect everything from the tilt of your phone to the temperature in the air to our location on the globe, right? So there's a lot of different things that sensors can do, but at the end of the day, they're all kind of following the same process. And so I want to give you an example of what that looks like for GPS. Now, you've probably heard of GPS. Is incredibly common nowadays to have that in phones or GPS devices, where it basically gives us some navigation, tells us how to get from A to B, right? And so what we're going to look at is that process of how we actually get GPS data and turn it into something useful in a program. So we start off with getting a satellite signal beamed to our phone. Now we call this environmental data. Okay, these are things that we're getting from our environment that maybe individually would not necessarily be useful or even understandable to us, right? So if you ask me where am I at, I could tell you I'm in a room, and I could tell you my approximate location within that room, but I can't tell you the exact latitude and longitude down to the foot of exactly where I am at this point right now, right? But these GPS satellites, when you have multiple of them, can actually do that, right? So they're beaming down this information, and we have a sensor that takes that information and turns it into something that's actually kind of understandable by us. And that's generally what sensors do. They take environmental data, which oftentimes is analog, but does not have to be. And when we say analog, we're meaning non-digital signals. So if, for example, I'm talking into this microphone right now, that's really analog. It's not digital, right? So it's taking this microphone signal, the movement of that microphone, and it's taking that and turning it into a digital signal that's being recorded in this presentation, right? So oftentimes sensors will have an analog signal that they're converting it to digital, but regardless, they're taking information and they're turning it into something of value to us. Now, in this case, our GPS receiver, our sensor, is going to take those values, do some calculations on them, and it's going to give us back a latitude and longitude, amongst some other things probably, but we'll just focus on the latitude and longitude. So we ask our GPS receiver, hey, where are we at? It comes back and tells us, hey, here's your location. Now, what do we want to do with that? Well, if I'm doing something like a mapping application, I probably want to have that display on my map, right? And so generally when we ask for these values, we don't just want to discard them, right? We want to keep them. We want to use them for something. And so we typically store them. Now, what do we know that can store values for us? If you guess variables, you would be right. So we oftentimes will store them as a variable before then using them in our program. Now, we've gone with the first step is collect that environmental data. Second step is translate it into digital information. Third step is store it as a variable. This last step is going to be taking that now and using it in our program. Now, we've learned a lot about how to use various things in the drones, whether it's to turn on the LEDs or make it move around or take in user input. We've done a lot of different things, even with time and pausing it and keeping track of time. So there's a lot of functions that we've learned to interact with the drone. Okay, and those have been predefined for us for a lot of things. And we learned even about things like flying in sequences, like circles and squares, without having to actually program those in manually. And so when we have those collection of things, we refer to that generally as libraries in Python, right? And so we go to the CoDrone Mini library and we use tools from there to interact with the CoDrone Mini. Now, in software applications like, let's say, Google Maps or Apple Maps or one of those, they have something very similar. It's predefined functions that we use to interact with those tools. Because again, these are incredibly complex applications. We don't want to have to write our own mapping application from scratch. We just want to be able to use theirs. And so what we use is what's called an API, or Application Programming Interface. And so what that allows us to do is take this variable and then plug it into a function that Google or Apple or whoever has developed for us, and then it takes that information and turns it into a location on the map. So in the same sense, we're going to be doing the same thing with our drone. So let's look at a different example. Our environmental data is, let's say, the battery level of the drone. So a sensor reads the battery level, which would actually be current, flow, and all those kind of things, turns it into a digital value. Let's say it's a percentage, right, of the battery left. We then store that. We can then tell the LEDs to blink a certain sequence based on what the battery level is. So our LED functions and commands and sequences that we learn are kind of the API of the drone that we're interacting with, and the result is this beneficial behavior, right? Maybe if it's blinking green, the battery is good. If it's blinking yellow, it's not so good. If it's blinking red, we know that we're starting to get low battery, right? So we can create that using these as API. In our case, we've been calling them again libraries. So that's the general process for how variables work in a program. And the rest of this lesson, we're going to start playing around with some of those variables and then see how we can interact with the various sensors in the drone.